I really appreciated your comment. Because yeah, most of the time philosophy equals in people's minds studying Heidegger, reading Being in Time 30 times, getting kind of the nuance of his thinking and so on. And don't get me wrong, I definitely think there's something about the human being that doesn't come out properly if there isn't a book you wrestle with. Like religions have known this, whether it be the Torah, the Quran, the Gospel. There's this idea that there's these like religious texts that you need to not just read once, but keep reading and kind of hit your head on it and over again, try to get to the meaning of the text, knowing you'll never finish or exhaust it. There's something about philosophy as perhaps providing ways to emulate that. And you could say a lot of education has tried to emulate that practice. But the problem is, you get in trouble if you over identify that practice with the discipline. If you say that practice of reading Being in Time or Hegel over and over again is philosophy, now you've made a mistake, as opposed to saying that practice does something to the formation of the person that's really important. I think one of the main things it does is make you realize, oh, wow, when I think I know something, I haven't even begun to scratch the surface. I thought I knew what Jesus was doing. I thought I knew what the Bible is. And now I'm reading, you're reading Luke or Romans, and it's as if for the very first time. And you're like, what was I even doing when I first read it? It's a huge revelation to how reality unfolds to have that experience. And if you never have that experience, that's a major problem. You become overconfident. You become too certain of your ability to immediately discern. And that's when you are pretty susceptible to end up thinking something or pulled along by thoughts that you don't even realize you're being pulled along by. You're just kind of pulled. You just kind of absorb the zeitgeist of the world, like secondhand smoke, as Rand put it. But that practice is not identical with philosophy, even if it is a way to go about philosophy. Philosophy has so much more to do with relational dynamics. And that was just something we were stressing. Like philosophy that's not brought into relation and that dialogos and that conversation and that back and forth is hardly philosophy at all. It's more of studying the history of philosophy as opposed to the spirit of it. But I think the same goes with theology and Christianity and the Holy Spirit. Studying the history of Christianity or the history of the Holy Spirit is not the same as the dynamic that appears between people.
Yeah, and I was going to make the connection because I feel like there's a strong connection. So I'm Catholic, but I'm around a lot of Protestants here in the city, and there's an immediate sort of reaction to um the practices, the rituals, the liturgy of the Catholic Mass. And a lot of people will say like, what are all these movements? What is all of this about? And I think a lot of people can see it, and even Catholics inside of the Catholic Church can begin to see all of these practices as just that. They're just practices. They're uh un, unattached from a real relationship. But I mean, that's what we're getting into. Like, what does a relationship with Jesus look like? And I think that relationship with Jesus is necessary to have to make this the whole ritual, the whole liturgy, the practice, the sacraments of the say the Catholic Church make any sense, to make them relational. But it's definitely a different um, it's a different dimensionality of relationship that you have with Christ than you have with just another person that you can see. I don't know. But I definitely yeah, just I mean, I guess reemphasizing that presumption that the Catholic Church tends to look like from the outside and even often from the inside, like just a bunch of practices devoid of relationship.
Well, I think that's exactly, what many Protestants can claim, or that can be kind of the concern. I think what we see is that relationship. I think a lot of the times there's this idea of this either or between practice and relationship, where reading the text, there are practices, but we kind of know that in a relationship, your ability to relate is tied to practices. Like, I can't just say, for example, hey, I want to be intimate with you. I want to have an intimate relationship. That's like C.S. Lewis saying, when people say, let's have a good conversation, that's precisely when the conversation's doomed. You can't
All right,
plan it,
let's go. Yeah.
right? Like, so you can't plan relationship. You can plan proximity. I can plan to be near you. I can plan to be in your vicinity, but how do I plan a relationship? You can't really do that. In the same way that you can't plan revelation or insight or depth, right? You find yourself reading and then bam, you find yourself talking and then bam, right? So you can't prepare these things. I mean, you can't plan these things. Now,
Mm-hmm.
a way to look at practice, and I think this gets into the prayer conversation and, like you're saying, relationship with God and different things. Many of what people call practices, which are practices, I'm not saying that term is wrong, but what's interesting is when I use the term practice in sports, we always know practice equals preparation. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's why you practice. You're preparing for what? The game, right? You're not just practicing for practice's sake. It's always in the context of some sort of preparation, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so what ends up happening is actually many of the intellectual, religious, human practices are actually preparation for something. The issue
Mm-hmm.
is we don't know what we're preparing for.
Yeah.
So therefore, like when I go to wrestling practice, I know I'm preparing for the wrestling match. Therefore, I'm good. But when you do say Catholic practices or practices that I think actually enable you to say experience the fullness of life, for example, like patience. If you ask people, what are you preparing for? They don't know, right? They're like, well, I'm just doing it because I'm supposed to, right?
Mm-hmm.
And with time, because it's hard to articulate what exactly religious practices are preparing for, you forget
Yeah.
you're preparing for something and the practice becomes
Yeah.
an end in itself, right? So
Yeah.
there's a kind
Yeah.
of amnesia that sets in. Like it's absurd to think of a world where a wrestler says, "Oh, I just go to practice for practice's sake." There are no
Yeah.
wrestling matches. There's never a
Mm-hmm.
wrestling match. That doesn't make any sense, right?
Yeah.
Um, well, that's the kind of, I want to say, weirdness a lot of people now feel toward religious practices. But that's not because there's something fundamentally wrong with practice. It's that we don't know what we're preparing for. We don't know what the game is, right?
Yeah.
And I would like to argue that the game is strongly tied to actually surprise, encounter, the moments of encounterology where difference is there, the moments where the mystical and the relational are possible, but only to the degree you're prepared for it and you don't ruin it. You're able to witness it in the right way. I think I
Uh,
think I think Christianity has gotten in trouble. I was just speaking with Luke about this. There's a lot of de-emphasis on spiritual warfare. Now that's a loaded phrase. It depends on what we mean by that phrase. But but the Bible is full to the brim with a notion of an unseen realm that you need to be aware of, right? Now, that can get into everything from bad ideas you don't know are bad ideas that get into your head and kind of parasitically control your life. But there's an idea that there's a kind of, dare I say, spiritual game that's going on
mm,
that you want to be prepared for. And if you're not prepared for it, then you end up in enclosures, like Michelle and I were saying.
mhm.
You end up in these enclosures, right?
Yeah.
So I think for me, I guess to start is that the mistake, I think generally the mistake that can happen in some Protestantism is the idea that the practices are seen as a good end of itself, which is, in a sense, problematic if you can't articulate the game that the practices are for. And since there's a general amnesia on what exactly all the practices are for, you have people doing the practices because they know that they're supposed to, but they don't necessarily know why. Or you have people saying the practices don't matter at all on the on the Protestant side,
Mm,
and both of those seem to actually be opposite positions, but both of them are actually in the space of the amnesia of what
mhm,
exactly the practices are for. And it's about, I guess the last thing I'll say here, it's about actually meeting the conditions of being actually able to handle, dare I say, the spiritual warfare, the ability to
mhm,
apprehend the fullness of life, to be able to
mhm.
participate in communal spaces in a way that make them alive. Like a way to look at it as well. I think many of the spiritual things are. I can't help but use the example from Owen Barfield that's famous, but it's just so useful. He points out that a rainbow is not relative. A rainbow is conditional. It has to be sunny outside, it has to be raining, and you have to be standing in the right place, right? That doesn't mean a rainbow is relative because anyone in those conditions would experience a rainbow, right? A lot of the preparation and a lot of the practices are to meet the conditions of experiencing spiritual reality, like that rainbow. That is not
Mm,
relative and it is not merely subjective. There's a very concrete conditionality that makes a rainbow possible. It's just that that concrete conditionality is not something you can just will like a machine. You have to wait till
mm,
the weather's right. You have to be in the right environment. I
mm,
think intimacy and relationship is like a rainbow. You have to meet the right
mm,
conditions to have it. I think intimacy with God is like that. I
mm,
think, but then also some issues can occur where sometimes the practices of which create the conditions of intimacy themselves can be difficult and not feel so intimate. Like wrestling practice can feel bad versus winning wrestling, which then, if you don't have the right, I guess, mental schema of the relation between practice, preparation, and condition, you could take that as evidence that you're doing something wrong, that this is not the right thing. And then I think what ends up happening is in Christianity, when there's that lack of intimacy, notably perhaps on the Protestant side sometimes, then to fill in the void, there comes to be this kind of moralization. Like, oh,
mm,
you don't feel intimacy? Well, that's good. That means you're really in faith, right? Because if you felt intimacy and enjoyed it, that wouldn't take faith. So good, good. Just study the
interesting,
Bible, don't
interesting.
do the practices. But that's a cope. I think that actually
Mm,
becomes a kind of cope of the inability to kind of identify what exactly is going on. Now, I'll pause, but all of this is to say
mm,
there's a framework, a schema by which to think the relationships of these things, which
mm,
again would be an example where I think something like philosophy and theology is necessary because the schema is not self-evident. The relationship between all these things are not given by the facticity of reality. You have to think them together and see how they relate, and then go through the work of those things. But I'll pause.
mm. I have a lot of thoughts, but yeah, you went very far with that. One of the things that I'm thinking of is yesterday we had an estuary meeting, and great as always. But one of the things that we had mentioned was this idea, and this is like, you know, vastly generalizing to a certain degree, but that the whole uh the whole pursuit of science, you know, our desire to science comes out of a religious framework. Like most of the early scientific fathers, like the fathers of science, were Christians, and they had this belief that there was some sort of rationality, intelligence to the world that can be apprehended.
Right.
And but there's like a certain intentional forgetting of faith in order to pursue science in a very quote scientific way. And I think there's we've gotten to the point, and this is not my point, but I think many people have made this, that we've forgotten our
Yes.
faith
Yep.
that underpins the whole pursuit of science, and we've lost the why we're sciencing, and we're just sciencing for sciencing's sake. And we had mentioned that yesterday, and I feel like that's very pertinent to what you had just mentioned here in practicing for practicing's sake. But like on a and maybe we're dealing with this issue that wouldn't have been dealt with prior to, you know, the scientific revolution, this real strong change in the very fundamental framework of humanity, or at least Western humanity. And maybe we wouldn't have struggled with it in the same way. But I think in that McGill Christian right hemisphere, left hemisphere, right hemisphere, that would have been like a pre-left hemisphere move, like prior to the scientific revolution. And again, I'm definitely generalizing here, but now we're having to, like you so beautifully said, to sublate this left hemisphere overly rigid analytical perspective back into a more holistic right hemisphere mindset. And yeah, I found what you were saying about to 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 I forget, let me forget how you had said it, but essentially that to sublate something, you have to enter that thing into relationship. And I mean, I think that's like the literal move that, I mean, very narrowly speaking, like that's the very literal move of sublating that left hemisphere frame of mind into a right hemisphere frame of mind. And I just found that to be it's obvious to some degree, but at the same time, it's like why didn't I think of framing it like that? Um,
Well, I mean, what I was going to say, it's very interesting because I think the entire idea of disinterestedness getting to truth actually comes from science. And there's this idea that, oh, we actually want to have this disinterested lack of emotion, lack of intimacy, because that's real faith. Because if you had interest, then it's not faith, it's just emotion. All of that actually is assuming basically the ontoepistemology of science, which you could say religion generates science and then forgets itself in its creation. We make our tools and our tools make us. And so there's a notion of disinterested process being the way that you're most, quote unquote, objective and most likely to get truth, right? And in this sense, science is not, it should be noted, science is not anti-subjectivity. Like, it's not like they're saying subjectivity is bad, but the idea is that subjectivity has such a tendency to get in the way of the truth, quote unquote, that you want a method to keep it out as much as possible, right? Now, if you're looking for scientific truth, yeah, you want the scientific method, you want a laboratory. And the key to the scientific method, as Jonathan Rauch puts it, and I really do like how he talks about it in Kindly Inquisitor, is that the scientific method is the idea of arriving at truth that no one in particular would realize. And the idea of that is if you were to go into the lab, you would see the same thing as I would see if I went in the lab, or Michelle or Sarah or whoever, right? That you create conditions where the conclusion is not person dependent, right? And this can be incredibly useful for obviously technology and trying to create infrastructure that everyone can share in. No one in particular is exclusively enabled to use. Like, it's very useful for that. However, if indeed in Christianity, and you could say once you move into something more metaphysical, if indeed truth is a white stone name, to use Luke's term, it is personal. Like there's a point where truth becomes, kind of to move into Hegel, absolute versus merely truth. So a way I like to put this is truth is Wittgenstein, the world is everything that is the case. Hegel's absolute, which I think aligns with the Christian notion, is the world is everything that is the case plus us, which changes what is the case, which changes us, which changes what is the case. And there's this ever spiraling that occurs, right? So science is very useful for getting a material basis for the work of the subject, but it cannot replace the subject, if you will, right? And the subject is a being of whom's truth is a becoming, not just a being. It's a becoming that is inseparable from their personhood, right? And so what ends up happening is that what's happening today is a certain reclaiming of truth as more absolute. Not that we have to use that language, I just use it based on the absolute knowing of Hegel, which is fundamentally relational. But the point is, we are recovering now a notion of truth that is alive and that is becoming, right? Well, in order to recover this, say in Christianity, Christianity has to reclaim all of its own self ideas out from under the zeitgeist of scientism and modernity that it's recovering from, right? Like you could say a big thing that Peugeot or Peterson has done is reclaim the reading of biblical texts outside a modernist framework, right? It's always wild to me when you go back to St. Augustine's work on Genesis, and he's talking about Genesis as not being literal. And you're like, what? I thought the literal reading was the oldest reading. No, it's after the Snopes style in modernity, and it has an idea of truth having to have a certain literality to it, as opposed to a literary sort of function that actually is more absolute, because it is more of the formation of subjectivity. Now, that's a large subject, but the point is, a lot of things that we think are old are actually not old, and there's a certain recovery of that today. But you see, our ideas of, this is my point, our ideas of, say, reading the Bible, for most people in Protestantism, it's still under a correspondence theory of truth. which is modern. It's not a participatory notion of truth. The idea of practices are still, even the notions of tradition in Catholicism are tied to, well, you need to know the tradition to interpret the text correctly in order to correspond with the truth best, right? As opposed to tradition, perhaps being more of the living practices needed for you as a person to meet the conditions necessary for you to access the rainbow that is reality, right? So all of these, and I think this goes to prayer as well, all of these fields are still kind of drenched in the residue of the modernist onto epistemology that makes it hard to think these things and then hard to recover these things. And then if you recover them, you still need a community to recover them. And I think a lot of the TLC is trying to spread the recovery to many people so you can have network effects and community based on these changes, right? Because a lot of people are, say, going to their local churches and experiencing the local church as still captured by the paradigm of modernity and onto epistemology, by which all of these things are still being thought under because they are still drenched in these notions. And so people are finding one another to get beyond that and to form community in those terms. But then the name of the game is not to, you see, I think this is where there's a temptation to say, well, modernity was a mistake, science was a mistake, throw all those things out. Well, life before science and modernity was full of war, full of violence, and very, very difficult. The issue is how to regain, to use that, and then I'll throw it to you, how to regain the McGilder quest, to regain the right brain after the left brain, not, like through the left brain, in the context of the left brain, right? And we've gone through a historic period of training the left brain so well that now we forgot the forgetting, and now we have to remember the forgotten forgetting, which is very difficult, but relationship can help with that. And yes, I guess I want to say the reason why relation necessarily sublates is because because sublation is always an incorporation of otherness. Like it is, and you see, you can't truly believe in otherness unless you're in relationship. We can talk all day about other people and the importance of community and all of that, but if you're just sitting at a table, that's very different from the experience of the person who is very different in their views or has different priorities or is disagreeable or has a lot of emotional baggage or doesn't quite enjoy your comedy. Like that other is very different than the abstract notion of the other. But the issue is the abstract notion of the other creates the illusion of sublation, but not the actuality of it, because the presence of the other as a full embodied and emotional field forces you to change. Yeah, I mean, we all actually know this. Like when you enter into a space, you talk different, you act different between different people. Like everyone is affected by the presence of the other person in how they behave. And it's not fake. It's not a mask. It is a natural calibration that occurs given this other person, because if you don't do it, you won't be intelligible to them. The space won't work, right? So that's an example of the natural movement of the beginnings of sublation. There's just the question of how much are you going to prioritize that? How much are you going to invest yourself in that? And how much are you not going to run from that, right? And then the argument is basically every single field, whether it be philosophy, economics, theology, sociology, whatever, literature, to the degree that it realizes the fullness of itself is to the degree it is able to operate it and handle those kind of spaces. Otherwise, it is not actually going to rise to the fullness of itself. It's going to just be used in service of the ego. But I'll pause.
How would you, I mean, I know you began defining it, but maybe you could sort of define it a little harder. Like what is sublation, and how, like what is it that you're doing in connecting? What is it that you're doing in relating in I guess how did you say, incorporating the other into your very being? What does that look like? And how would you define that process?
No, that's an excellent question. So the word sublation is from, say, German idealism, Hegel. The German word is Aufbauung, I believe, and it means the new that incorporates the old. So it's this rising up, but not leaving behind. So it's a
It's like
really
a flower growing.
Yes,
it
that's
sublates
correct.
the
That's
seed. It
correct.
sublates.
That's correct. So the passing over into otherness. So the embryo becomes the baby, the seed becomes the tree. But here's the funny move: does a seed equal an oak tree? Yes and no.
Mm,
they're like one another, but it'd be silly to say a seed equals the oak tree. They're clearly
mm,
distinct. In the same way that the leaves of an oak tree are not the same as the branches, right? Like the
mm.
tree is like the whole tree actually consists of a bunch of things that aren't equal to one another, and yet we refer to them as a whole, which is very odd.
Parts aren't the whole, but they are unmistakably connected. Yeah.
Yes, this is the weird thing. Like basically the key um basically Hegel, and there's a lot of readings of Hegel, and I've already told you I used to really dislike Hegel, but then you realize your readings were entirely wrong. Um, Hegel is basically calling into question the entire whole parts distinction. Like there really are just holes curving into other holes that are part of more like a harmony, right? Like a
Mm,
leaf is a hole that works in relation with the branch to create a new hole that includes the old holes, but in a new hole that are coordinating, you could say, at higher levels of complexity. But
mm,
those levels of complexity are not better than the old because they only exist because of the old, right? Like it'd be
mm.
silly to say Beethoven's ninth is better than a violin because it doesn't exist without a violin, right?
Yeah.
And yet would also be silly to say that a violin is the same as Beethoven's ninth. That doesn't make
Mm,
sense, right? So what ends up happening is sublation is an invitation to basically think of all reality as coordination. Wholes coordinating with other wholes, which means all of reality is relational because coordination
mm,
is relational. And here's the key: there are qualities that things can be that can only be in the sublation, in the relation. Like a tree can only be a tree in the coordination, if you will, in the relation of the leaves, the branches, the time, the soil, the dirt, the birds. All of those things have to coordinate together like a
mm,
community. They have to commune together in order to be a tree, of
mm,
which is a whole that is distinct from all the wholes that make it up. And yet it can't be known except without all those things together. And this creates a
mm,
new quality of being, right? So
mm,
let's take people. When people meet one another, they act and behave and think of things they've never thought before. They develop parts about themselves that has never been there. The person you are once you go into community is different from the person outside of it, and who you become is different. Like the whole of you becomes inseparable from the whole of the community and the people that you meet, and there's a constant sublational activity that is occurring,
mm.
right? Like you
Yeah.
become different, and yet the thing you become is yourself. The difference you become is yourself, right?
Yeah.
Like you're different in
Yeah.
community and yet you're not different, right? So basically what Hegel is pointing out is he thinks that how do I put it? He thinks that many of our metaphysical categories are it's not that they're wrong, but they're kind of very outdated. Like
Yeah.
imagine it's kind of like imagine we were still using um Newton without Einstein, and then Einstein without, Whitehead or something. Like imagine we
Mm,
were still using Newton today. It wouldn't be that we were wrong. And actually, 90% of the time, we still do use Newton. It's fine.
mm,
And yet, we'd be incomplete and we would inevitably run into problems that we couldn't overcome. Like, you need quantum mechanics to do computers, as I understand it, right? So, if you didn't have quantum mechanics, you couldn't do a lot of the technology we have today. I think GPS uses that technology. So, basically, what Hegel thinks is that philosophically and theologically, it's as if we're still using Newton in a world where we need quantum, where
mm,
we need like higher physics. So we
mm.
become confused. So, for
Yeah.
example, the distinction between same and difference. Well, for Hegel and Leibniz would agree, there's only similarity because two things can't be the same without being the same thing. They're not two. So
Yeah.
same,
Yeah.
there's no sameness in reality. But in the same
Yeah.
sense, there's no true difference because if things were so different that they couldn't relate, then they'd be unintelligible to one another and there'd be no difference. So there's only
Yeah.
similarity.
Well,
Like,
I
so
had this based on that explanation that everything, whatever that means, is a whole, and that there are no, in a certain sense, there are no parts. They're just wholes in relationship with each other. In that sense, if everything is just a whole, I don't feel like you can say a whole and a point are equivalent. But what constitutes a whole if it is just constituted of wholes? Like what does that really mean, or what is that getting at?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it gets at reality being more like music than a machine. because the notes are intercepting with one another, creating new qualities. It's blossoming qualities, right? Like
Harmony.
it's more like music. Reality becomes more like music and lyrical, to use the Jan Zwicky lyrical philosophy idea. Like what it would mean is that reality is not so much a tower being constructed up. It means it's more like a piece of music that's being played and it's unfolding according to different qualities. And then those qualities have upward causation. You know, the only causation is not horizontal, there's upward causation. Like once you have a tree, that has an impact on the branches and the leaves. Like the whole then has top down causality on the rest of it, as there's bottom up causality. And causality goes both ways, actually. It's not just one way. That's why determinism is not entirely true, because there's top down causation. That is, in fact, influenced by bottom up causation, but it's not reducible to that. What I mean by top down causation is that once leaves come into a relationship with a branch that makes them part of the tree, the leaf behaves differently than if the leaf fell off the branch and was lying on the ground, right? Like leaves that are part of a tree are still participating in photosynthesis. They still have a function with the whole. So what the leaf does is impacted top down by the whole it is part of. But if that leaf was separated, it would have a different function. It would do something different, right? And then it would perhaps be affected by the wind differently. Like the wind affects it differently than when it's part of a tree. So the causation, so what this means is that causation is not one way, it's both ways, which is call and response. You know, Ross Barrett has made that point that the logic of the Bible is more of call and response than cause and effect, right? Yeah, that's like music. Like music is call and effect, call and response, right? So it means that reality is creation is creating, it's ongoing, and history is a process of different quality, different musical movements, different notions that are unfolding. You could view it as growing complexity. There's complexity science that's kind of talking about. You get a very different depiction of reality versus the primary thing being, say, quantity or building or entropy. What you start seeing is a process of reality trying to, you could say, learn how to be, more beautiful, I think, ultimately, and learning how to be more negentropic versus entropic, and learning how to create different qualities of being. So what it would mean is the way that wholes interact with other wholes is not, it would be more like how a violin interacts with a piano. Like they create a music together, right? It is not that the violin, I don't primarily use a violin to hit the piano and move it across the stage, right? That's kind of silly. That breaks it, right? Really, I use a violin to create, I want to say, a field that then the piano can generate a field that it participates in. So there's a field causation, I want to say, which is very different than taking the violin and hitting it with the piano. Now, I, of course, can hit the piano with the violin. Bottom up causation, traditional causation is still at play, but the universe has generated the possibility of a different kind of cause and effect, which is call and response according to fields, right? Now, so you could say that the universe is developing in a way to generate the possibility of new fields, of different kinds of causations, of different ways of behaving, that now the piano and the violin are able to interact with one another. And here's the key. The violin and the piano are able to interact with one another without changing their composition. It's not like the violin materially has to change to interact with the piano. In their very distinction, they are able to actually write music and generate a whole that makes music. And here's the other thing. Daniel, can then hear that music and be inspired to go write a story or to hum it as I'm walking down the street. So now that whole has impacted my field that I carry with me that may generate something in reality which could inspire someone else, on and on and on. You get a high order causation is another way to put it, than a low order causation that works according to fields. So that would be what I would say, that the way that fields, that wholes interact with other wholes is, in fact, they don't, what defines the interaction of a whole with another whole is not simply material proximity, but that it changes the processing of the things involved. Like the way the violin plays is different around the piano than when it is by itself. right? Like the way a leaf behaves when it's part of a tree is different in the processing, the photosynthesis, than when the leaf is detached, right? So
Mm.
there's this different processing that occurs. Another example is when birds fly together. A bird flies differently apart than when it's in a pack. You see these shapes kind of
Yeah.
emerge, right? So there's a different processing that occurs.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
that would be one way I'd get at your excellent question.
For sure. For sure. So do you want to kind of expand on this understanding of whole relating to whole, the call and the response in relation to prayer? Like how does this elucidate your understanding of prayer?
Oh, I think that's excellent. I think, like we were saying last time, I think prayer is a mysterious topic that many people are confused about and they're not sure what to think. And it's something I wrestle with and think about all the time. I think it is not self-evident. I think it is an example of something that people say, oh, you ought to do. And it becomes like
Mhm.
one of those practices that's a good in of its own right. But then it's like,
Mhm.
what should I do? Do I ask
Yeah.
God for stuff? Am I supposed to increase intimacy? But I can't just will to increase intimacy, right? There's this kind of idea that some people talk about prayer as like spending time with God. And
Mhm.
the more you spend time with God, the more you create intimacy. But there's actually a fallacy in this because you can sit with a person in a room for a long time and not increase intimacy at all. You can just feel enclosed, or actually, you can feel snuffed. It's actually a
Yeah.
mistake to conflate spending time with increasing intimacy. Even though increasing intimacy entails spending time, it is
Mhm.
not identical with it,
As
right?
opposed to,
Um, and that gets into love languages, Gary Chapman, and different. Like you have to. Here's the key: you have to know the person in their personhood to know how to spend time with them in a manner that increases intimacy. You
Mhm.
can't like you can't basically just say, well, I don't need to know who this person is, and it doesn't really matter who I am or what I've done or what I'm cultivating, as long as I spend time with them, that will then create intimacy, right?
Mhm.
That does not work for relationships with people. And yet we can talk about as if that would work with God, right? As if God will do that. And as if it works that way. And then there's also, I think, almost a logic of quantification, which is the idea that your relationship with God correlates with the amount of time you pray, right? That there's a quantitative trait, right? I think that's erroneous. But I think it all follows from a certain confusion about what exactly prayer is and what one is doing in prayer and what is it. Um,
Mhm.
so um, if indeed reality has this kind of field effect, then there's something about prayer that I think is actually cultivating and situating you in relation to reality in this field way. So, for
Mhm.
example, it's like you're playing the violin with the piano that is the world and God in order to make music, right? That you're taking seriously this interconnectedness in this way that how you carry yourself in the world impacts the way that the world unfolds and how you
Mhm.
relate with it, right?
Mhm.
Um, I think there's a lot of people who have prayer in a correspondence theory of truth, meaning I pray for X, then we'll see if X occurs, and that will prove God exists. Or that
Yeah.
will prove I prayed correctly. Like I will
Mhm.
see something in reality that corresponds with my prayer, right?
Mhm.
Whereas we've been talking about how there's the personal and the participatory truth that
Mhm.
actually impacts your unfolding, right? And how you're in the world and how you're becoming, right? So I think the first thing is prayer is under the paradigm of modernity and truth, versus the absolute in the Hegelian sense. It's under that scientific paradigm, actually. And then, funny enough, that means prayer is supposed to be disinterested. It's not supposed to be emotional. There's a kind of like scientific sort of mindset you're supposed to have going into it, as opposed to giving yourself over. It's something we mentioned last time. Like the Psalms, I think, are models of prayer. And they're mad. People are mad. They're like, God, why'd you do this? They're laying it all out, right? They're not, and it's very interesting because there's this mixture of worship, grievances, hope, desire, but also like knowing better. There's something about the prayer in the Psalms that almost becomes more like a journal in a certain sense. It has a kind of
Mhm.
journal function to it, which is very interesting. Um, but the point is that I think part of the issue is we are approaching prayer often from a modernist mindset. We're not approaching it from a right, I'll say a right brain mindset. What would it mean to consider prayer in the context of the right brain, right? Well, it would mean it is increasing your capacity to apprehend Gestalt, to see the whole, to not
Mhm.
schism. Obviously
Mhm.
McGilchrist has that sabra, that cutting, right? So to what degree? So the first thing I'll say is that the first thing is I think there has to be something about prayer that is keeping you from sabra, cutting, left, right, like cutting reality apart, right? If prayer is cutting reality apart, or cutting it down, or breaking
Mhm.
it off, then it is anti-Gestalt, it is anti-music, and it is modernistic. And if it is modernistic as such, then it is probably going to be in service of a correspondence theory of truth, um, instead of a formation. It is not going to be forming you. And it would
Mhm.
seem as if prayer has a lot more to do with forming you and who you are and what kind of subject that you are. There's a
Mhm.
whole lot more to say, but I'll pause right there.
Well, the cutting, the saber analogy reminded me of in that first book that you had given me, the comparison between the glacier and the veil. So like the, I guess the veil, like the cutting, the, I guess, believing in this hiddenness, this, I have to get past this thing in order to experience prayer or to experience God, is a sort of cutting or a removing a layer of this relationship that in turn you're losing it by trying to go, I guess, into it by getting rid of a part of it. So I guess, I mean, just that analogy is, I guess, erroneous in the sense that you're necessarily seeing the veil and the thing behind the veil as two separate things. And in turn, there's a sort of dissection or a cutting between those. And so I guess this glacier understanding that the whole thing is the glacier, that you can't cut apart the glacier in order to experience more of the glacier. I don't know. I just I feel that connection, but I'm curious if you can kind of more intelligently expand upon
No,
that
I
in
think you were very
connection to
clear.
prayer.
That is exactly right. So there's another thing here. There's this idea that God is everywhere, right? That God is here, He's in you, He's everywhere. So what does it mean to say I don't feel intimate God, or I feel God is absent, or He's not around? There's a way in which it can't mean that, but it also does mean something, right?
Mm,
So there's one sense in which God is always present, right? But the way I think about it, and I'll use this analogy for the glacier example, it's kind of like a radio signal, right? Like the radio signal is all around us constantly, but there's a certain tuning, a certain condition that has to be met to hear it, right?
yeah.
That's very different though from saying that I need to go somewhere, or that the signal is not around, right? That it's
Mm,
cut off from me, right? So God is not cut off from us. It's that there's a signal of attunement that I need to be tuned into to experience. And it's actually no different than with people, right? Like that's the difference
yeah.
between relationship and proximity, is to the degree the radio dial is tuned, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
intimacy is not a matter of finding so much as it is attunement, right? It's like tuning the radio signal. It's not about getting on the
Mhm.
other side of the wall, on the other side of the divide. It's about the attunement, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a certain sense in which prayer that is a kind of mode of I'm not talking with God, I'm not with God, now I am with God, is like wrong, right?
Yeah.
Like prayer can't be a unique space in a certain sense, right? Because
Mm,
God is always there. It would be like, well, I'm focusing on God, I'm now
mhm.
focusing on God. Well, there's something problematic about that, because in a relationship, like with your wife or your spouse, there's a certain, it's like, okay, now I'm focused on you. Oh, great. That's great. Now that you're done with work, you can focus on it, right? Like right there's a certain problem in the framing,
Yeah.
right? On this
Yeah. Yeah.
idea
Yeah.
that I'm now going to focus on you. However, there's also something problematic in a relationship if there's a kind of quota of focus, like I'm expecting you to give me X amount of time,
Yeah,
right? That
yeah.
kills intimacy as well, right?
Hmm.
So the idea of a healthy relationship is not a quota of time spent, but a certain notion of, even if I'm at Mead Lake, even if I'm at work, I'm nevertheless tuned into the radio station. That is my marriage.
Hmm.
I'm tuned into the field, like
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
tree and the leaf, right? You're always kind of tuned in. So the question
Yeah.
becomes, what does it mean to think of prayer instead? Like, I think many of us think of prayer as basically, I'm going to speak with God, right? I am now speaking with God. And I don't want to say that's false. But I also want to say that there's something about prayer that is more like keeping the radio station on the right signal, which is
Hmm.
what you already have to do with your family or your spouse,
Hmm.
even if you're elsewhere. Because otherwise, when you come home, the disconnect, you feel the disconnect, right? Like you can feel if the person has not been in the relationship for the entire day and now is
Yeah,
trying to get
that's interesting. That's very interesting. Yeah.
so that kills intimacy, right? Well, the same thing happens with God. And so that's actually, we're thinking about prayer as the space in which I'm communing with God in of itself is a quantitative logic that kind of creates a division that's not really there, even though there's some sense of truth with it. Um, but but really moving more in the direction of the radio signal, the glacier, um, is far better. And then the question is, what does it mean to think about prayer as keeping on the right radio station, like keeping the
Mhm.
signal in the right place? I'll
Yeah.
pause. I'll pause with that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously the verse from Paul talking about how I'm to the essentially the goal is to praise like unendingly. So
Yep.
there's obviously this understanding of an ability to, in some meaningful way, to be in a constant state of prayer. And I think in the Orthodox tradition, I think it's called hesychasm, to constantly be in a sort of state of prayer. I'm not super familiar, so if I got that wrong, then I got that wrong. Um, but yeah, I mean, it calls to mind. Like I've been very interested in your framework theory. I don't know, just like how important framework is and how important that that recognition. Like I love your line that there's a necessary level of skepticism, a sort of humility, you could say, to look at your framework in order to either take on a new framework or to at the very least um, be more understanding as to what your framework is doing for you or not doing for you. And I think maybe looking at prayer as maybe not as a framework in and of itself, but I think I'd be curious what how you would connect a framework that you view the world through and prayer, and could maybe would you associate prayer as a framework in which to inhabit and view the world? But then it asks the question like it still begs like what does that prayer, that framework look like for you? And obviously it looks very different for a lot of different traditions, a lot of different denominations. But I'm curious about that framework in prayer and what you think.
Oh, it's an excellent question. Well, I have a very strange theory of prayer that I found extremely helpful for me and help make sense of it, because I think we were mentioning last time, it's always been odd to me. I don't want to say how little theology of prayer there is. I think generally there's a pretty serious confusion or not clear. Like there's actually not a lot of it sounds very strange. I don't find there's a ton of books on prayer. I know Philip Yancey did it, but there's a few. I think Bonhoeffer here and there. But it's always
Mm-hmm.
interesting to me how there's this kind of, well, everyone knows what prayer is, and then
Mm-hmm.
also a simultaneous of nobody knows what prayer is.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
there's this weird double thing going on
Mm-hmm.
that I always find very interesting. And admittedly, um, the Bible is not 100% clear in the sense of like when Jesus like, okay, let me tell you what to do when you pray, and he gives you the Lord's Prayer. Does that mean that's it? You just do the Lord's Prayer? What about? And then he's in Gethsemane, and it's interesting because he seems to be asking God for something, but then also saying, "But if it's your will." let that go. So does prayer ask for things or not? Then of course it seems as if prayer and worship are tied together, that there's something supposed to be worshipful about prayer. And then again, I do go to the Psalms because I think the Psalms are models of prayer, and those can be like journal entries. God, why don't you kill all those people? Or God, why did this occur? Right? Like, and also there's an idea of, I think it would be a mistake to assume that all of the Psalms equal God's will, like what God wanted. It can be the voicing of David if we think David wrote them. These are the voices of his own heart, and yet the voicing of his own heart is considered important enough to make part of the Bible, right? That's
Hmm.
kind of interesting. So anyway, one of the things I think is hard for us to understand is I like to think of the question of prayer um, in light of William Ong, Marshall McLuhan, and people like that. And what William Ong talks about is how nomadic societies, verbal societies before the printing press and the written word, they didn't have an inner voice. If you felt something, you expressed it. If you felt that person's an idiot, you said they were an idiot. There was no break between what you externally felt and you internally felt. There was no space, is how he puts it, right? And Dr. Anton talks about this with Guy Sengstock. It's a very good conversation. And really, it's the idea that um, there was a lack of inner space. And you also see this in, you could say, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Rabbi. These were people who had memorized the Torah, like they'd memorized it. So learning was more in service of memorizing the Odyssey, the Iliad. Like it was memorization. It really wasn't an inner space that that you had an inner voice in, right? Yeah, this point should be noted that in Confessions, Augustine was amazed when his mentor was reading silently. Up until that point, people only read aloud. They couldn't read silently, right? Like, so reading silently was remarkable, right? So the reason why I bring all this up is we always have to keep in mind that when Paul, Jesus, or the entire Bible, First Testament, Second Testament, this isn't a pre-literate society. This is before the printing press. Yes, there was writing, but there was no printing press. So the writing was mostly memorized by people. It was not a people of reading, right? So this would also mean, if William Ong is correct, and I'm inclined to think he is, that these people did not have an inner voice. They really didn't have much of an inner voice that was going on. You People today are constantly in their heads, constantly talking in their head, constantly undergoing an inner voice, right? But back in the time of the Bible, this would not be a common thing. And so there's an interesting idea that this emphasis on prayer is actually like prayer is the development of an inner voice, actually. Like it is the development of an inner voice. Like that is not there. So Jesus is actually commanding us. We as Christians are supposed to develop an inner voice. This is something people do not have. And we're supposed to develop it. And there's this idea that inner voice, and then it's also very interesting to think of that inner voice being tied to what it means for the Holy Spirit to dwell within us. That like when people are like, what does it mean the Holy? Well, that's that inner voice, actually. And actually to the degree that you make it the Holy Spirit is really important. So in a weird way, if this is so, that would mean our problem today. Here's the weird thing. That would mean our problem today is actually not a lack of prayer. It's that all we do is pray. It would mean that we're constantly using our inner voice, and we've forgotten that we have forgotten that that is the voice of prayer and the voice of God and the voice by which we are communing with God. And in that sense, there's a weird way in which we have no idea what prayer is because our entire inner lives are defined by prayer, actually.
Hmm.
And what we need to do is recover that. Now, I'm not saying it's so straightforward, but what this has done for me is made me realize, however imperfectly, that anytime I use my inner voice, that I am speaking with God, that I am engaged in prayer, right? And what do we mostly do with our inner voice? We talk about how dumb those people are at the store. We talk about how idiotic everything is. We're mad all the time. We're like David in the Psalms. We're constantly journaling to ourselves. We're using the voice that way. And then what's really weird is how I'll catch myself and go, wait a minute, I'm praying. I forgot. And actually, oh my gosh, I'm actually, using prayer to talk about how overwhelmed I am by having to get taxes done, right? But God,
Yeah.
God loves you. He knows you have to do taxes. So praying about that to him or being it into his presence is not a problem. But you see, also too, and I'll pause. There's a lot more to say about this, but this is a way that thinking about prayer has helped me. Because
Mm,
also, how do you destroy intimacy? A way you destroy intimacy is if you're using your inner voice to talk about why didn't my spouse appreciate me? Why do they think that way? If you use that inner voice to talk about how upset you are, or even if you're talking about how stupid you are all the time, right?
mm,
What kills intimacy, but using that inner voice in the wrong way? Like the
mm,
enclosure, when you get enclosed and you kill relationship, you're often talking to yourself, right?
mm.
So this actually shows how powerful prayer. People are like, prayer is powerful. Prayer can change the
Yeah.
world. Yeah, man, it can. Because when you start using that inner voice to talk about how angry you are, upset you are, you can kill your marriage in 5 seconds. You can
Yeah.
destroy your mental health in 5 seconds. Like you can use that inner voice to change the world real fast. And
Mm,
so when you own that this inner voice is not like, because I think it is interesting to me how there is a confusion about what exactly that inner voice is, what its function is. Is it thinking? Is it ego? Is it you? And how there's simultaneously a mystery about prayer and what that's doing, right?
mm,
And so for me, finding an overlap between those things, it's the only way as well that I can make sense of this idea of like pray without ceasing, right? Like
mm,
Paul's like pray without ceasing. So in a sense, that could mean develop an inner voice that is always active in communing with God. And please
mm,
note back then, if you developed the inner voice, it was probably easier to use it in service of God because you weren't so habituated to using it all the time because you're in a literary society. Like back then, you'd really have to make a point to use the inner voice. So it really would be a difficult practice to engage in. Whereas now,
mm,
because we're so habituated in it, we can use that inner voice without as much energy use. In fact, we just find ourselves in it, just find ourselves doing it, right? So, in
yeah.
a sense, what we have to do today is make using the inner voice hard again. It was hard for them. Today, it's
Yeah.
easy. So, we need to make it hard again, which means we really need to train it and own it. And my belief in I would say from my experience is that really, really owning the development of that inner voice, which again, people will associate with capturing, controlling your thoughts, having control of your thoughts. There's Buddhist practices that are part of this that I think have validity. But there's this idea of, there's also a difference though between using the inner voice to commune with God and getting rid of the inner voice. Like
Mm,
that's kind of
mm,
like also the difference between getting rid of science and using science, redeeming science, right? Like today there's a temptation to say science is evil, technology is evil, when really we want to redeem it. Likewise, there can be a temptation to say, well, just kill the inner voice and get rid of it, right? No, we need to redeem it. We need to sanctify it. And working and tearing with the inner voice, I think, is part of creating intimacy for all of reality, honestly, because it actually increases your ability to perceive reality, to experience blue more like blue, and all this stuff Lewis says at the end of the last battle. But the greatest trick of it, and I'll stop, is that you forget. You'll be going about your business, and then you're just in your head again, upset. You forgot. Like it makes me think of Plato
mm,
and memory and recovering memory. Like you just forget that you're praying. You forget that you're in this mode of prayer. It's not that you need to pray, it's you forget that you're
mm,
actually speaking before God. And again, this helps make sense of this idea that God is everywhere too, right? That you are always in relation with him, that it's music playing
mm.
with other music, that you're an instrument, and the music that some of the music that you're making is this inner voice. But I will pause and throw it back to you.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we had talked about this the last time we had talked, but I mean, I think that it's there's a lot of power in that understanding. One of the things that it makes me think about is faith or belief. I think obviously there's a relationship between faith and belief and in prayer, but I also think that to a certain degree you have to. I mean, I think faith you have to step into and live in order to believe in it. Like I think there's a certain like you have to take that like leap of faith to believe something by stepping into that thing that you want to believe in. Um, so I guess it's a similar question as to like what is prayer and how does one pray, but how does one believe in prayer? Like how does one come to the belief of the power or the truth or the necessity to pray and to relate to God? Like how do you get to the point of like I'm obviously Christian, but there's still I think parts of me that want to believe more than believe. And I know there's the prayer like Jesus help me help like I believe help me in my unbelief. There's there's a level of where like you can step into it, but there's still belief that has to come almost outside of you, outside of your will. And I like you almost have to receive belief to a certain degree. I'm curious how you connect belief and faith, and maybe there's a difference between them that I'm just not seeing right now. But between those two and prayer.
I think that's outstanding. Well, first, if that voice inside of you is going on about how your coworker doesn't appreciate they're late and you're getting angry, well, you're probably not wrong, actually. That voice probably has a point, right? It would take faith to, despite the evidence, despite what you feel, and despite the ways that person has perhaps let you down, you nevertheless stop that voice. You stop it from saying those things. You instead remind, you say, God, I'm really feeling this way, but they're a human being. I don't know what's going on in their life. Help me actually see this experience like as an opportunity to grow in you. And then to gauge to the degree that you are then doing the work of that prayer to the degree you're controlling your inner voice. Like it takes faith to actually challenge your inner voice, right? Because your inner voice usually is valid. It's based on something. It's rational, but it's not non-rational. So you end up in a Nash equilibrium, right? Um, I think also there are things about faith as well, where if you believe X, Y, or Z, then you do continually put yourself in the spaces of someone who would believe those things, because the spaces you go in work on your loves, as James K. Smith, right? Like the people you are around work on your love. But the thing I want to say before I go on that is that in my experience, the greater you take control of your inner voice, the more you experience life as alive. The more you don't have at the end of the day, your energy has been drained because you've been mad all day. The more you've actually, it's not that you've repressed your anger, it's that you've directed it in toward worship or toward doing the work of actually experiencing reality fuller. I think the other thing too is another key to faith is courage. I think courage and faith are basically the same thing. I think to the degree you work on your inner voice is actually going to have a big impact on if you do the thing you need to do that requires courage when the time comes up, because that voice is going to give you a whole lot of reasons not to do the thing. It's going to give you a whole lot of reasons, rational reasons, to not be courageous. And if you haven't been preparing yourself for those moments by doing the work and controlling your inner voice as a means of as praying, then you probably won't do the courageous thing. And here's also an issue. There are consequences. There are consequences in life. So if you come to a decision that you have the spirit telling you you need to do X, and you know you should do X, but you do Y, and you go down the path of Y, it is not that you can't be redeemed or that things can't be recovered, but it might take 3 months. And in those 3 months, you'll be in a dry spell. Because in a sense, that's a grace. Like if you were not in a dry spell, it would be like God actually hiding the fact you're in hell or something, right? Like that you're actually missing out on the fullness of God, right?
Yeah.
So there's also something to be said. Now that what tends to occur is then another decision, like the decision comes back around after those 3 months, where now you can do X instead of Y. And that's where the redemption occurs. I think sometimes Christians can talk about redemption as if it's just snap your finger kind of thing, right? At any moment you can turn around. Well, at any moment, God can begin the process of turning around. And I think God always begins the bringing the opportunity for courage back. I think life will afford new opportunities for courage, and you can always now do it then. Now, there's an issue where if you didn't do it the first time, I think sometimes it could be harder the second time. And if you didn't do it the first time, why would you do it the second time? Well, only if you've been using that dry spell to prepare, only if you've been using that space to get ready and building yourself up, right? So that can be an issue as well. So the first thing I want to say is if you take seriously, faith is needed to train your inner voice and thus train your prayer life. Second, faith is acts of courage that are tied to courage. And God will give you lots of opportunities for courage. And then also, funny enough, I want to say is that uh, there is the faith that is the making of the decision that puts you
Hmm.
kind of, and you can, and I think you can experience quite clearly when you can experience qualitatively when you are where God wants you to be. I think you can experience that. But then there are a lot of decisions along the way that can abandon that. So there's a
Hmm.
choosing to get on the path and then the choice to sustain the path, right? So you have
Hmm.
to sustain the work and keep it going, right? And in those periods, often faith is in the form of not giving up the work, right? Where you have to believe that a lot of faith work is not quantifiable. It's like a garden where you are planting the seeds and then for weeks you see nothing. Like nothing's going on. It's like, oh, it's not working. And then one day it happens every year. It like grows all at once. It's exponential,
Yeah.
not linear, right? Whereas
Mm.
with a machine, it gradually builds and you can see the progress and you know that it's 1 + 2, what 3. In faith
Yeah.
work, it's 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 20. It just boom. It has this
Yeah.
explosive. It's rhizomatic. So there's also the faith of sustaining, which is like a garden more than building a building. You have to see the dry dirt. You have to do all this work, and and then some of the stuff dies. Some of it dies, right? But you wouldn't say the garden is a failure because your squash died. Okay, 2 squash plants died, but that's just the nature of a garden. There are some things that are going to happen that aren't going to work, but the rest of the garden blossoms, and you had to have the 2 things that the lantern beetles got in order to have the rest of it, right? So also
Yeah.
faith is building something that isn't vertical that topples all the way down. It tends to be more like a field where you're doing much more experimentation, much more kind of growing where things kind of come up. But precisely because you don't know the outcome ahead of time, you can doubt it. Where
Yeah.
because your friends can come along or your family can come along and say, "What are you doing? It's just dead dirt." Right. Whereas if you were building a tower, everyone could see, "Oh man, you're making progress. Wow, it's really building up," and you wouldn't have to, face that ego work as well.
Mm.
So for me, also, I think faith is metaphorically the growing of a garden. I think you identify the questioning of if it's doing anything as the necessary work of developing character, because it takes
Mhm.
character to keep planting a garden if it doesn't seem like it's doing anything. And then
Mhm.
faith is going to have this blossoming effect that is possible because you kept doing the work. And I guess what I want
Mhm.
to say too is another way to actually help your unbelief, because there's a question of how do you help your unbelief? I think as you do it and you see it happen, it becomes easier to keep doing it. As you
Mhm.
see these surprising things happen, these people you meet, these things happen that otherwise would not occur because you were putting in these spaces. You get much more, almost like you get much more of a taste and sense of how it works, how the
Mhm.
spiritual economy works, right? And if
Mhm.
at the same time you're in that faithful presence, to use that hunter term, as you're doing that, you're also doing the work on your inner voice to control how your inner voice talks and what it says, and seeing that as work of prayer. And then you're also along the way making decisions of courage. I think that really all comes together to sort
Mhm.
of see a qualitative change in your life that you feel that then
Mhm.
helps your unbelief, because you see that it is not merely a kind of gnostic how do I make myself feel belief. It is in doing these things that you live in belief, because if you think about it, this
Mhm.
whole way of life is a kind of in belief, right? Like
Mhm.
you're not giving in to the rational impasses. You're planting a garden when you don't see anything yet. Like this is a life of belief. Like you're living in a manner that only makes it. Like let's put it this way: you're living in a manner that only makes sense if you believe. Like no one
Mhm.
could look at this and say this makes sense. It only makes sense for someone who believes in these things, right? And so that
Yeah.
means you have belief, right? Like I think we can view belief
Mhm.
as an emotional state, and I need to get myself into the emotional state. Whereas the argument I would make is that if you look at your life and you kind of say it would only make sense in the context of
I
belief,
see.
then I think the emotions come, actually. I think
Mhm.
it's not the emotions to the different way of life. I think it's the different way of life to the emotions. I think it goes the
Mhm.
other way around. And
Mhm.
and then when you see the fruits of that, which are very real, I think that also helps with it. But that would be ways I would begin to approach your excellent question.
Yeah. I mean, I was reading not too long ago, in like a little Bible group, a little prayer group. the story of Hagar and Ishmael, and how she at that point had given up hope, uh, that she would be able to survive, and that she was willing to put her son down and let him die and go away so that she didn't have to witness it. And that in that moment, like, God, reveals to her that he'll make a great nation out of Ishmael, and that basically to look up, there's a well. And like, I guess the question is, was the well there before, or was there faith that gave her the eyes to see the well? And I think that in a very real sense, faith does give you eyes to see things that otherwise you wouldn't see. Whether or not they were there prior, sort of beside the point, but that with faith, you do get eyes to see things that are not recognizable, not maybe in the way that you described the holes. You can't see the harmony that these holes are playing if you don't have the right framework, if you don't have the faith to see those holes creating this harmonious, greater Gestalt whole. Um, yeah, I think that's an interesting. I mean, essentially a point that you brought up about faith and prayer and um, belief coming after sort of the practice of belief. Like you were saying, I think it's an interesting way to reframe it. That you have to step into faith, sort of act out the things that, if somebody believed this, these are the things that would need to be done. And by doing that, and then by desiring that frame, you can begin to see, in a sense, that the fruit of that work. I don't know if that sort of jumps away from your understanding of it, but
Well, what I'll say is everything you're saying is extremely important. A way to look at it is you have to get really, really good at doing things indirectly, which seems impossible. And the reason why you have to get really good at doing things indirectly is because things only blossom fully when they're done indirectly. So what I mean by that is, well, let's go back to the Lewis example of if you say we're going to have a good conversation, it kills it. Why?
mm,
Because it's too direct, and if it's direct, that means it's in the left brain, it's in the ego. So the issue is if it's in the ego, because the ego cuts and designs and it's top down, it kills it, right? It's like if you want your garden to grow and you really want it to grow, and therefore you bring it into the realm of the mechanical, it dies. It doesn't work because you put a bunch of chemicals that kill it, right? So likewise, if you and your marriage say, I really want this to be a good marriage, I really want this to be a good marriage, you actually kill it. Because there's something about the human being that when we focus on something in the direct way kills it. Like we actually, in
yeah,
a weird way,
sort of
we
pressure on that thing
yeah,
in like
yeah, we
a
kill it.
genuine way. Yeah.
That's right. I mean, we really do have kind of the knowledge of life and death, of good and evil. Like we have the ability to say this is life, so I kill it. But the problem is because it's the knowledge of good and evil, we can't see something good without doing something evil to it at the same time, actually, because the knowledge of good and
Say that one
evil
more
is like
time. We can't.
just to play on this idea is that it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which I always think is fascinating. Why isn't it just the knowledge of evil, right? But it's more like good and evil as if it's hyphens, good hyphen and evil, like a dynamic. Like we're stuck in a dynamic of good and evil where the things that we think are good are evil, the things that are evil are actually good. And the way that we go about doing good actually makes it evil. Like we as human beings are constantly caught up in irony where doing that which is supposed to make things good actually make it worse and so on. So for me, it's just interesting how it's the knowledge of good and evil. The function of that and is really interesting, as if they come together. Like they have a tendency to come together.
Ah,
You,
interesting.
you know, which
Like
makes
the two sides of the same coin,
yeah,
in a sense.
that's right. We tend to view it as good and evil as if they're separate, but that and is really interesting because it kind of suggests there's an interplay between good and evil now, which we see all the time. People have a good idea of how to fix the world and they make it worse, right? People, like a lot of the most evil people in history, had quote unquote good intentions or they had ideas, right? So
Yeah.
actually, we're trapped now in this ironic dynamic of what we know is good. We then, in that very knowledge, go about in a manner that kills it or makes it evil or destroys it, right? So we're
Can I
stuck
pause you
in,
for 1 second?
please.
Because I literally wrote the one thing that I wrote that I wanted to mention to you because I was watching the enclosure video. is for you to explain a little bit about the deconstruction of the notion of good, which I already can see that you're heading that way. But I just wanted to say like that is one of the points that I wanted to talk about. So just yeah, please
Well,
continue.
that's
Sorry to
exactly it, because the problem is our
yeah.
notion of good is actually a dynamic of good and evil that actually entails evil. You have to deconstruct good in order to let forth beauty that entails good in a sublated form. So the
Yeah.
problem is we have to deconstruct our idea of the good to experience the good, right? Because that's the
Yeah.
problem, is we're constantly trapped in ideas, ergo enclosures, right? And that's why we have to be indirect. Um, so the point is, like, if in your marriage you say, I really want to make this work, or you become really nervous or anxious, you kill it, because in your very acknowledgement of the good, your knowledge of the good, marriage is good. If you focus on it in the wrong way, then you actually unleash into it a dynamic of good and evil. You unleash into it a control spirit. You unleash,
Mm.
now you're going to be monitoring it and making sure it's good, right? And that everything is
Mm.
happy all the time, and it becomes repression and it becomes miserable and people don't feel
Expectation,
free.
that expectation that it
Expectation
has
sets
to
in.
be good makes it
That's
bad in
correct.
a certain
That's exactly right. So you unleash your very knowledge that love is good, ironically unleashes the knowledge of good and evil, a dynamic
mm,
of an interplay that creates ironies constantly, right?
mm,
So
mm.
that means a good marriage has to somehow be indirect. But how do you be intentional about being indirect?
Intentionally unintentional in a certain way.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
exactly right. Right. Well, I'm biased, but I think artists, the phenomenology of the artist is often a great example of this. Like a great storytellers create practices where they wake up in the morning and they find themselves in story, or a great hip hop cipher doesn't plan every verse. They're just prepared for the unexpected and they meet the unexpected. They don't plan. Great artists are prepared for the inspiration. They're prepared for the moments. They don't plan the moments, right? Like when but they do a whole lot of planning to be prepared for the unplanned, right? That's the
Mhm.
weird paradoxical dynamic that is necessary to address the paradoxical dynamic of the knowledge of good and evil, right? It's a paradox that matches a paradox, if you will. And you see, it's very similar, like, well, you become, what you want to do is be intentional about your space making, as we talked
Mhm.
about when you visited. Like you're intentional about your space making so that an unexpected thing can occur that is beautiful, that you can meet, right? So one of the ways you become very intentional about being indirect is being very intentional about the spaces you make, or the fields you create, or the kind of shine, or music that you generate as a gestalt, right? What kind of field are you making, right? Like you become very intentional about that, because that's being intentional about the indirect, right?
Mhm.
Because like good
Mm.
marriages are art forms of indirectness, which you could argue is kind of Eastern versus Western and kind of things. But there's an architectural sort of logic where what you're doing is you're not trying to control the outcome. You're monitoring the energy or the field or the emotions of the space that, if those aren't good, the seeds aren't growing. Like another way to look
Mhm.
at it is all gardens are kind of indirect. You don't directly grow the seed. You create the conditions where the seed can grow itself. So you indirectly grow the seed in
Mhm.
that way, right?
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
So likewise, what you're doing is focusing on the conditions, the environments, the fields, the gardens of your life, and you're making sure that the nutrition is there. You're making sure that the water is there, that the sunlight is there, that you've controlled your inner voice to so contribute those things, that you've actually
Mhm.
come to control your anger and your emotions, so that when you talk with your spouse, you talk with people, you're not destroying the field, right? You're doing that work.
Yeah.
Now you don't know what the outcome will be if you do that work, maybe nothing, but you definitely know it will be nothing if you don't do that work, right? Because the only alternative is to be direct about it, but that kills it, because now it's in the control spirit. So you've got like three options in this. Well, you can be direct and kill it, okay? Like you direct, and also you can be direct with machines and scientific and not unleash a dynamic of good and evil,
They're
because
not
it is.
living, they're not relating.
That's correct, right? The problem of the knowledge of good and evil, like we didn't. Let's put it this way: we couldn't figure out how to deal with the knowledge of good and evil, so we basically got rid of it in by getting rid of relationship. We just went to the
Mhm.
scientific. We went to the engineering. That's not the knowledge of good and evil. That's just the know-how, right? So let's put it that way. We we have gone through history not knowing how to deal with the knowledge of good and evil, which we have. So
Mhm.
we've repressed it by focusing on know-how. But you see, that is anti relational, and that leads to the
Mhm.
meaning crisis and nihilism, But that means to come out of the meaning crisis, you've got to learn how to deal with the knowledge of good and evil, which is what we're doing the work now of recovering and figuring out how to deal with, right? And you see,
Mhm.
since the knowledge of good and evil cannot be used without unleashing a dynamic, what you have to do is, being aware of that, you focus on indirectness. You focus on the
Right.
environments of creating gardens, of creating fields. Now, of
Mhm.
course, they themselves could embody knowledges of good and evil and unleash certain dynamics. So ultimately, the space has to serve the relationship and the raw, surprising encounter of the other with the I that then you meet in relationality in a manner that you're prepared for, that you don't plan. Because here's the key: if it's prepared for and it's live, you can't, it's not, it's participatory knowledge, not the knowledge of good and evil. That's
You
planning.
can't know it in any meaningful sense, because to know it is to control it, and to control it
Exactly.
is to be direct and kill,
That's correct. So
or
what the
and for a living thing, yes.
That's correct. So the way you deal with the problem of the dynamics of the knowledge of good and evil is to create environments and experiences and spaces of encounter, of
Mm.
surprise, where you can't have any pre-knowledge, right? And that is where intimacy is created. That is where beauty is created. That's where deep friendships are made, in those spaces of participatory knowing, right? Where the surprising occurs, right? Your deepest relationships are not planned. Your deepest, and I
Mhm.
would even argue your deepest relationships are not primarily defined as doing planned things together or making plans. Not that plans are bad. I would just argue that your most intimate relationships are not primarily plan based, that they
Mhm.
are impossible to quantify outside the living of it or the experiencing of
Mhm.
it, right?
Mhm.
So therefore,
Mhm.
it is participatory, and therefore, it is outside the knowledge of good and evil, because you could say that in this
Mhm.
sense the sublation of the knowledge of good and evil is love, and intimacy. That entails a kind of knowledge of good and evil. The
It's
good is,
almost there's a humbling, like a necessarily humbling, like
yes,
so to be like gods is to know good and evil, but then in that sense to be like gods is to kill.
yes,
It's to ruin, it's to prevent life to grow. So you have to like necessarily dumb yourself down. And I
yes,
use that not literally, but in a generative way. You have to take yourself down to take
yes,
yourself up, which
yes.
is the whole, you have to humble yourself from
That's it.
believing that you can know, that you can control, in order to allow for the thing that you want from controlling to happen in this relational growing otherness sense. Yeah.
Exactly right. Because due to the problem of the knowledge of good and evil, you can't go from here up.
Yeah.
You have to go down up. And
Yeah.
down means you go, I'm going to go into that which I can't predict. I'm going to go into
Yeah.
that which I can't control. And that the down now enables a sublation. That's the thing. Like, you go down, you gather, and you now bring, because that means you're able to lift without it being in terms of the knowledge of good and evil, which, if that were the case, you would have the dynamic. So what this means is exactly what you're saying. Given the problem of the knowledge of good and evil, which we can also think about as the problem of irony, the problem of good
Mm,
intentions, the problem of
mm,
having the good like being our prime operator's notice, like what's good to do. But the problem is we define the good, as opposed to having the good unveil itself to us.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And when
yeah,
the
yeah.
good unveils itself to us, it is then participating in beauty and truth, right?
Mm,
So you get
mm.
all three. So the knowledge, what that problem means of the knowledge of good and evil, means there has to be a kind of step down to where you allow occur what is unpredictable. Because if it is predictable, it is in the knowledge of good and evil. So you have to step into
Interesting.
spaces where the unpredictable can occur, and that is then how you move in a sense beyond the problem of
But
the knowledge of good and
there's a
evil.
sense in which that stepping down for the unexpected, you know, to a certain extent, something unexpected is going to happen. So there is like this sort of sense of knowing, but it's knowing that I must step out. Like I must remove myself in some way from the outcome. But you also like very like subtly know the outcome in the sense that you know that it's going to be something good, or I guess the faith is that that will be something good. But I guess that's the necessary, that is what faith is to say
Yes,
faith is not I know something is going to happen, because if you know something is going to happen, nothing's going to happen. Faith
exactly.
is to say I believe something will happen, because,
Yes,
time has told many a times
yes,
that something happens. But yeah, I mean, I just think it's so interesting that this being true. We seem so far removed in our society, in our general framework to allow for this seemingly simple truth to take hold. Like, why is this so? Why is this so? Like, why are so many people so antagonistic to this understanding of faith? Not as this, because I mean, you hear all of the like the classic atheists on YouTube saying like, faith is just to believe in something that there's no value or there's no reason to believe. It's just unfounded belief. But like in this light, it is obviously so much more.
Well, what you were saying is belief in the unexpected, that is faith. Like you have a knowledge of the unexpected, so there's a certain faith that is occurring there, right?
Yeah.
And also please note the motion. There's an incarnational God comes down, like descend and then up that's going on. So faith has a certain likeness to Jesus, therefore there's a descend and there's an ascension that occurs in that. And there's also a courage, because if I come down, what if I come down and never come back up? What if I come down and
Mhm.
something unexpected occurs that kills me or that is destructive or that is bad, blah, 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 right? So
Mhm.
there's a courage in this motion. So the knowledge of good and evil has this stepping down, incarnational, and then up to the tree of life, like up into the New Jerusalem. But you have to take the step down. Otherwise, you don't get the whole heaven and earth, right? If you go straight to
Mhm.
heaven, you're in trouble. But if you go to earth and you stay there, you're in trouble. But the ironic thing now is we're going down to earth and we're staying there in a modernist scientific mindset precisely to make sure we don't waste our time, which guarantees that we waste our time. So you get that problem. I think what you're pointing at is it is very difficult for us to recover the notion of faith is because we're under a 20th century, propositional, to use Vervaeke's term, propositional knowledge paradigm. And so then faith is seen as a relation to propositions as opposed to a participation in a life architecture. We don't see faith in terms of terrain or architecture or topography. We see it in terms of syllogisms. And that's very modernistic. The idea of primarily thinking of truth as something you write on a paper and turn in to get a grade on a test is a very new idea. And so, in this sense, the New Age atheists were extremely valid to deconstruct that idea of faith. And actually, you could argue they have generated new thought about what faith is, and they made way for Peterson and Vervaeke and all these different, like all of that kind of made way for this kind of rethinking religion that has been going on.
Mhm.
Because in the deconstruct what they deconstructed in a sense was a fallacy, was wrong. It was actually, but the funny thing you could say is that in the name of deconstructing religion, they actually more so deconstructed a form of religious idolatry that didn't know it was
Yeah, 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 yeah,
idolatry.
yeah. They were
So in
doing
that,
God's work
they were doing God's
unintentionally.
work. Yeah, that's right. Like God uses the enemy armies, right? Like God uses it, like you
And
can't help it. And so, in that sense, I think people, the New Age atheists or that crowd, have actually been extremely. There's been a grace in this deconstruction of this idolatry. The issue, though, is so a function of the church um, needs to be preparation to receive people who come from under as kind of refugees of a deconstructed of idolatry. Like, the church, like there's been an idolatry that's been destroyed and unveiled as idolatry. And now you have these refugees, in a
mm,
sense, and the church needs to be able to receive them. What you could argue is that the church, notably in the 2010s up to certainly before COVID, was not exactly ready for the refugees of the deconstructed idolatrous faith, right? And so they didn't
mm,
know how to receive them. And they themselves were still under a bit of a modernist onto epistemology. And so the church suffered. And there's
mm.
been a lot of people leaving the churches, and everyone knows this,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Well, I would argue that has not necessarily been due to, there's a way to say, well, that's all the fault of the New Age atheists. They did that, right? Or, that's the fault of the church's failing. Well, in a sense, it's more so the fault of the churches not being ready for the opportunity of the New Age atheists. Like the New
Man,
Age
look at
atheists
that.
presented an opportunity of
Yeah.
deconstructing the idolatrous faith, and the churches were not ready to capitalize or realize that opportunity. You could say now they're more so realizing that opportunity, and that's starting to occur. And I think that's a very good thing. But I think it's important to see it that way, because then, in a sense, you're like, there is this debate going on are young men going back to church? Is there a religious revival going on? There are pew numbers. So, one thing, people have a different sense. There's a vibe change. However,
Mm,
one wants to see it. I think we are in a certain sublative moment of a kind of, there was an old that has been there was an old way of viewing that actually relative to us would be new because we have forgotten it, that actually makes sense of the 20th century in ways that we've not been able to make sense of it, and thus it is sublative, it is able to pull
Mm-hmm.
up. And I think it
Mm-hmm.
is moving in a more architectural understanding. And again, and then I'll stop, is like, so this is, I guess, what I want to say. If one wants to increase intimacy with God, and frankly intimacy in all relationships, because God is like, we're made in the image and God likeness of God. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Look in your life, and this is how I do it. Look in your life and say how much of this is happening? How many times do I step into an unexpected and then go up? And I say, well, I do it once a week. All right, let's move it to twice a week. Let's take a step. Let's try to do it more, right? How many times when I hang out with my wife do I do this, or do I try to go straight up, right? Well, let me try to go more of the stepping down in faith.
Can you give me a really practical instance, maybe like something that has happened very recently, fresh on your mind, of what it means to step down to go up? Because I mean, the analogy or the word that comes to mind is to humble yourself in order to go up. But I guess maybe what can you give me an instance of
Yeah.
stepping down into that unpredictable? Is it like just genuinely listening to somebody? Would you consider that a sort of humbling stepping down or yeah.
I think that's a great question. I'll get, an example that comes to mind, and I think many men can stress with this. So, obviously, the world, oil, with everything in Iran, gas prices could go up significantly. Barrels per oil could be like 200 a gallon, and that could mean that food costs go up. So, the one thing you can do is say, well, let me go buy as much food as I possibly can in case that occurs, right? And you, as the man, just say, I'm going to take care of the family, right? And that's not necessarily, in a sense, wrong. But then notice how it can unleash a paranoid dynamic, because maybe we need
Yeah.
4 freezer chests and, use all our money to buy food and, get ready for the end of the world or something, right? Now you've gone into a sort of paranoia. But instead, what you can do is, instead of just kind of bottling that all, it's like, well, let me not talk. I don't want to make everyone scared or afraid about the apocalypse or different thing, which is something I've done in the past. And there's some validity to it. But then there's also a certain idea of instead saying, hey, Michelle, this is what I'm thinking. And what do you think about that? Do you think that that's something we need to worry about? Instead of just kind of going ahead, actually coming down and saying, I don't know. I don't
Mhm.
know what the right thing to do is, right?
Mm,
I'm
mm,
actually
mm.
not 100% sure, because I can see both sides. I can see the
Yeah,
side of,
yeah, yeah.
don't worry about what's happening in Iran, because we should just worry about our immediacy and not what's going on in the world. But then there's the other side of it, is that's a dangerous thing if there's a serious event going on that you want to be prepared for, right? Like there's a ditch on the side of being overly informed and then underinformed, right?
Yeah.
And I can feel myself going crazy between that space, right? That's sort of like
Right.
madness of it. Well, then bringing yourself down, saying, I don't know. What do you think we should do? What do you think is the right balance? That actually, then you feel like your mind is not so crazy anymore. You're able to actually come down and say, okay, well, then what we're going to do is, yeah, we have space on the free. We like tacos. We like this food. Let's buy food that we're going to get anyway, that is cheap, that we can put in the freezer box that's going to last for 6 months. And you get a little bit of extra, you do a little bit more, and that's a responsible thing to do. But then you're not into the paranoid realm, and both of you in the couple have agreed on that. Right. And there are
Yeah.
also sales going on anyway at the store. Right. So what does it hurt? Right. So that's an example where then you're like, oh, okay, great. You're doing something that you were going to do anyway. You're just kind of doing it now, probably in case, and you've done it as a couple. So now you feel like you can move forward without moving forward in a manner that just leads to paranoia, madness, and everything else. So
Mm,
that's just one example. And I would say that as a form, though, I think there are many, many, many things, and I'll just speak to me. I think there are many times men in various decisions do this, where instead of talking with the wife or themselves, they take it on themselves to take
mhm.
care of the family. Now, don't get me wrong, there is something extremely valid about this. But then there's another way of making sure that valid exercise of masculinity is not straight up versus down straight up,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Like, make sure you've included the couple, included your wife, your flesh in the
Mhm,
movement. Because if you don't
mhm.
do it and you go off this way, you're going to destroy intimacy. because she's going to feel like you're off in some world and you're like, well, I'm only doing this for you. Well, you've killed
Yeah.
intimacy, right? Likewise, people like, I'm only doing this for God. And it's, I feel like I'm not close to God. I'm doing all this for God. Well, you got to do the down before you go forward.
If that was what he wanted to do, like, yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
that's super good because that is like, a lot of relationships that I've heard, like even recently that are, in a very difficult spot are I'm doing everything for you, or I'm already doing so much for us, but there is a lack of intimacy in which that truth is revealed. So even if it is true that you're doing it all for us, you're not doing it in a way in which I know and that I feel it. So it can be as true as this table, but it's not felt, and in turn it leads to the very opposite of what you had hoped for by doing this thing for this family. It's actually destroying it because you're not incorporating your family in that truth.
Yes, I think this is one of the most widespread problems of all. I think it is extremely widespread. I think it happens to Christians all the time. And in fact, it can almost be made worse by a certain ethic of I'm supposed to provide, I'm supposed to take care of things.
Exactly.
But
That
the
hyper
issue,
masculinity, yeah,
yeah,
that hides that.
the problem is what's happening there. It's always very important to note that when Satan tempts Jesus, he basically uses Bible verses. Like Satan does not tempt Jesus with like bad things, like lust or sex or something. He's like, you're the son of God, so turn these stones into bread and prove it, right? Like then, and he's like, look, you'll have the world, right? Like, isn't this what God wants? Like, Satan does not tempt. There's a weird way in which Satan does not tempt Jesus with anything that is false. Everything
Yeah.
he tempts Jesus with is in a sense true. It's
Mm.
disorder. It's out of
Yeah.
order. It's not going through the cross. It's on this side of the cross, right?
Mm.
But what
Mm.
is the cross but the humbling, the going down before going up, right? So likewise, the key is that many things that get Christian couples, and I will say couples in general, but I'll just say Christian couples can get in trouble because they know Christian truths, but it is in a manner that doesn't come down before going up. So that's just Satan's
Yeah.
temptations. He's just using, because
Mm.
Satan just uses Christian truths. He uses Christian truths to tempt Jesus, but they're out of order. They're not done in the
Mm.
right way. So then the question, of course, becomes, well, what is the order, right? Well, the order is always relational. You have to bring down to bring up, go to the cross to bring up. Now,
Mm.
I will say, and all of this can be expanded on, but I will say that perhaps the key skill that people lack by which to do this going down with the couple is knowing how to speak, conversation, talk, how to actually
How's your
listen.
life?
Yeah, and this
Let's
is why I
go.
think the social coordination mechanism is such a big
Mm.
deal. This is literally education for how to talk that we have not had in our society. People don't know how to talk. Men don't know how to talk. They don't know how to voice their feelings without going over the top. We also don't know how to hear somebody say, I feel X and not take that as a judgment. Like if your wife says, I feel upset, we say that means I did something wrong, right? Like we immediately take description as judgment. It gets us in huge trouble, as opposed to simply hearing it as information we need to work with and think about. Okay, you are upset. What is happening in the environment that is making
Mm.
this occur? Because if we're married, no one is intending to make one another upset. And
Yeah,
yet it is
yeah.
happening because of the knowledge of good and evil, because of the dynamics that get unleashed, right? And
Mm.
all dynamics, once brought into the word and language, can be killed, actually. Like once they are, there's a weird way in which the very articulation of a dynamic, because there's so much power in speaking, can actually destroy it, right? Like just
Mm.
take a situation with a couple where you say, I feel like both of us have been working really hard and we're not getting anywhere. Oh, I'm seeing. That's exactly what I feel, honey. Like just voicing the space that the couple feels in can go a long way to actually spiritually lifting things, right? Likewise, just voicing, I don't feel intimate with God right now. Me neither. Yeah, I thought I was the only one in church that felt that way. And now the spirit can move, actually. Like there's something about speaking and liberating that can go together. But
Mm.
that's why I think, unfortunately, there's perhaps been a spiritual warfare, demonic conspiracy to make education not about speaking and about memorization, which in a way means we're going back to a pre-Christian education. Because what did we say everyone in the rabbi and before the printing press is doing? They're memorizing, they're learning the Torah, right? So we actually
Law
now
as
have
a
we
dead set of prescriptions.
that's
Yeah.
correct. But that's all we do with learning now. We don't learn how to speak. Like education is supposed to be about speaking, which is about the unexpected, live, the dynamic beyond the knowledge of good and evil. But all we actually do now is learn knowledge in service of the knowledge of good and evil, which unleashes dynamics that are problematic, right? So learning how to speak is a big deal. I think what I would say then is, as a couple, really kind of having a certain grace for one another on going, we're just learning how to do this, or we haven't learned how to do this, or like part of marriage is learning how to speak together and to have those
Mm.
conversations without taking things personally, without getting nervous or upset. I mean, a lot of what Michelle and I are saying with Philosophize Your Life is arguing how philosophy can really help with this and
Yeah.
breaking up
Yeah.
enclosures. And basically, the more you can learn to converse, the more you'll be able to come down and
Mm.
not be overwhelmed and do it well, and then go back up together. So I think that's a part of the conversation.
I I want to like in another conversation, I really would like to talk about the social coordination mechanism a little bit more in depth. I really want to talk more and understand your understanding of metaphysics and then metageometry in that move, because I remember we talked about that in my visit, and I found that to be I want to know more about that. Obviously, you've given me some stuff to read. I'm taking my time reading that first little one. It's taking time, but I would love to talk about that as well. But then I would also like to talk about philosophize your life, like to understand more from you what that really means. Because like I had commented on the enclosures video I loved what you had said about poetry being the giving texture and dimensionality to words, which in a sense is like expanding your framework. It's expanding what you believe or can understand. It's expanding your vocabulary. And but at the same time, like this term philosophy to so many people is like immediately repulsive. Like obviously a lot of us in this TLC or in this section of the internet love philosophy, but we probably also like philosophy in the same way that people don't like philosophy. So I don't know if it's a word thing or if it's just a lack of relationship with the word as you're using it. Because I mean I think what you're describing in Philosophize Your Life is what every marriage counselor, every therapist, everybody wants, needs, is looking for. But I don't know if you need a bigger platform, Daniel. I don't know what to say. But at the same time, I also understand like, the locality, and as you scale, what do you lose and we could obviously talk about that at another point too, but there's just so much I'd love to talk about. Um, yeah,
Well,
yeah, let's go.
well, I love speaking with you, and we will have to talk about all those subjects. Alas, I
Let's
do have
go.
tours today, as
No,
and another word. Look, so there's a few things. Yes, I think people are repulsed by the word. There's a few things. Uh, there's a sense in which if you choose a new word, you do tend to leave behind the tradition, of which I think there is a lot of gold in, because I think a lot of these people in these traditions, whether it be a Hume, a Hegel, whoever, Aristotle, they actually, for them, philosophy was what we're describing. It's that it's been taught in a manner that is in a spirit opposite of what they believed in. And so
compromise. Yeah.
there's a way in which abandoning the word philosophy is in a sense to accept the framing of all of these great philosophers in history as being simply focused on systems and metaphysical notions that don't affect practical life. And I don't agree with that. I think Aristotle is extremely concerned with practical things. He's mostly spending his time classifying fish as a marine biologist. I think David Hume is extremely concerned about preserving common lives from power. These people are not these people are interested in the things that we're all interested in and about saving marriages and family.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just that they get taught in a manner that suggests they weren't concerned about those things. And then also it just turns out that these very practical things often you can't discuss well unless you get into the big questions, because it turns out the big questions are in the ground, they're in the soil, they're in the air. They're not as
And
out there as it seems. They're
yeah,
far more immediate than we realize. Because even
yeah,
if I just ask the question, oh, you freedoms and you said you had a good day, you have a good marriage. What do you mean by good marriage? Why do you think your marriage is good? Right? Like, suddenly you can find yourself getting into 2000 years of ideas, not even meaning to, just to
yeah,
describe
yeah, yeah,
what
yeah.
that means, right? So now, second, that all said, another word I like is voicecraft, based on my beloved Tim Adlin. Like, a lot of what we're talking about is voicecraft, the craft of voice, the ability to use voice in a manner that brings out the depths of the spirit, that actually is able to enhance relationships, that goes into deep questions, but brings it back into the immediate, like lives out the beautiful. There's a voice craft is a term that Tim Adlin has come up with that I like very much as an alternative to the use of language that contributes to our oppression and enclosure. So I definitely think that philosophy, when it is at its best, has something to do with voice craft, that it is a form of voice craft, because the power of life and death is in the tongue, and things are created through the word.
You'll have to
So
point
voice
me
craft.
towards something in that
Yep.
in the
Yep. Yep.
voicecraft
Yep.
world to check out to kind of
Absolutely.
to understand.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I think the world of Tim, and he's a very good friend over many years. But the point is valid on the rejection. But again, like you say as well, I definitely think that the therapists, the guidance counselors, the preachers, what they're actually pointing to is philosophizing your life, and
Yeah,
they're pointing to a skill set that is different from the skill of using a hammer, and yet nevertheless requires skill all the same. That is found
yeah,
in the voice, that is found in the relating, that is found in the making of spaces, that is found in the coordination of fields, that is found in the coordination of energies, and that it's a quote unquote science in the sense of the
yeah,
German word that means rigorous study, but it's not a science the same way as chemical compositions, right? But it's
yeah.
clear as day when you go into a room with good vibes. It's clear as day when you go into good relationships. It's just as
And it's
concrete.
dangerous because that can also fly off into the new agey world because like a lot of those terms have these new agey connotations to them that's like so you're in a very real way you're on both sides of the hard science and new age science like you're right you're playing right there in the middle.
That's the funny thing is all of the, you see, I think I'm of the opinion that in Christianity, in a sense, not owning a lot of the stuff that we're describing, then all of that can get taken in a different direction, because the church can't bring it in, because the church is incarnational, right? So it's heaven and earth. So you're going to have science. Christianity is going to give you science, and it's going to give you vibes. It's going to be both, because it is actually the meeting of heaven and earth, right? And if it doesn't own that, and it doesn't do it well in a way that can be articulated in a manner that is compelling, and this is voicecraft again, well, then a lot of these notions, like something like vibes, people experience vibes. That's why they're going to talk about it outside the church, because everyone experiences. It's a concrete experience that
Mhm.
people have. And if the church can't speak to vibes, if you will, then people are still going to experiencing them, and they're going to decide for themselves how to think about those things.
Yeah,
And that's where you can go
and
off into
disassociate them from church life or from
from
Christian
church
life.
life or communal life, or it can go
Mhm.
into like in that sense, I guess, to open a can of worms. And then yes, we do need to talk about the metageometry stuff, because that's big, and
It
a
seems
great answer.
related to what you're saying
Yeah,
even
yeah.
here.
I think so, because it is all of this is the study of the formations of the forms and things like that. But yeah, I think um people are having like we spoke at the beginning of kind of spiritual warfare, which is a loaded phrase, but there's an idea that there is a spiritual warfare, in that people are having experiences of vibes. If they can't find a way to articulate it or to make sense of it, they'll do it themselves, and they may do it in a manner that is the equivalent of giving in to a temptation of Satan in the wilderness, that is using the truth in a disordered way. And
Yeah.
that's basically a lot of what it's. I've never met someone who is totally devoid of truth or totally devoid of
Yes.
goodness or beauty, because then they'd have no
Yes.
substance. The issue is the
Yes.
disorderedness,
Yes.
right? And
Yes. Yes.
so,
Yes.
and that's an Augustinism, but that disorderedness. And so the issue is, but if order in this sense, which is not structural order, but musical order, an ordering of the notes in order to make the harmony, which has a structure to it, but it's not the same structure as a building or something.
Mhm.
If order is so important, then there is something incredibly important about articulation, voicecraft, design, putting things in order that the church and the Christian life is about. It's not so much necessarily about recovering or getting new things, because it is about actually ordering that of which has been presented and believing that that unfolds and unlocks new things. It's not about finding new
Mm,
things as in
mm, mm,
ordering what
mm,
is
mm.
and new
Yeah.
qualities emerging from it. If you have the gestalts curve and harmonize with one another, you get a tree. If you have all the holes, they're just not relating properly. So instead of finding a new hole
Ah,
or a new
so
thing, you bring
so
it into relation to generate a new complexity and a new quality, which is then analogous and harmonious with how reality itself is operating, like we were saying at the beginning, right? So if reality operates more like music and ordering the gestalts into the gestalts, then that's what we need to primarily do, which is a matter of design, which is a matter of ordering and a matter of articulation. And the better that you can do that, the more that you can bring things together into a kind of musical harmony that generates a new quality that then shines and attracts people into it. And if you can generate that field, then that's evangelical, because people want to be part of that, because they experience that. So
man,
they want to be part. You don't have to guilt them. They want to be part of the vibe,
this
dang it.
yeah,
They want to be
no,
part of the spirit.
so good, Daniel. I absolutely love talking to you. Can't wait to get
Blast,
down
my
to
friend.
Virginia again. It's
That was a
uh
blast. That was a
it
blast, Tyler.
was. Tell Haven and the whole crew I said
I will do
hey.
it.
I
And thank you, Tyler. It's been a treat. Have a blessed day.
Always a pleasure, Daniel. Catch you
Always a
soon.
pleasure, sir.